Hello and good morning. Good morning to you all in person here at the Resilience Hub in Glasgow. Beautiful, crisp morning this morning for the walk-in. Thank you all for joining us in person. And for those of you online, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining this first in-person event on the Energy Day here at the Resilience Hub. My name is Robert Kay. I'm a principal with ICF and also the Deputy Director of our Climate Centre. ICF is a consulting firm with around 7,500 staff worldwide, and I work in our climate team, which is one of the largest science-based climate teams in the world. This session is brought to you in collaboration with IEA, who I must say have been a fantastic partner in organising today's session. Really, the objective from today is to really think about what are the national and international perspectives around enhancing energy system resilience while also building decarbonised energy systems. We see that there are some potentials here for building virtuous circles to enhance resilience while decarbonising and decarbonising while building resilience. And we're really looking forward to exploring that with you all over the next 90 minutes. The way that we're going to run this is that we're going to open up with some scene-setting comments. Then we're going to go to an in-person panel here in the room. And then we're going to go to a virtual panel with a series of speakers online. For those of you in the room, old school, if you want to ask a question, put your hand up. If you're online, please chat your questions into the Gigabox platform, and I'll be monitoring those during the session, and I can then ask our presenters. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome for our opening remarks Miss Molly Johnson, and she is the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Low Carbon Energy Sector from Natural Resources Canada. Molly, the virtual floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to the International Energy Agency and ICF for organizing this very timely event. I'm pleased to be speaking to you bright and early from Ottawa, Canada, and on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Recent climate events around the world, heat waves, droughts, forest fires, extreme storms, they've all made us even more aware of the impacts of climate change, the implications for our energy systems, and the people and businesses that depend and rely on them. The IEA's recent report on climate resilience in the electricity sector has brought into sharp focus the significant socioeconomic costs of interrupted energy supply when a climate-driven disruption occurs. So in particular, it shows us our most vulnerable people and their access to clean, reliable, and affordable power is most at risk. Climate change, as we all know, if left unchecked, will add strains to the regional and global energy supplies, and we all need to act now. And so by integrating resilience into the planning policies and infrastructure of our energy systems, locally, nationally, and globally, we have a real opportunity in this energy transformation to tackle these issues and build systems that are really going to improve and strengthen our net zero future. A recent study by the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices found the cost of climate change to Canada's electrical system could range from 1.8 billion to 3.6 billion annually by the end of the century. The study also found some of the solutions may be simple changes in regular business, things that we can do just as a stepwise approach. So replacing transmission and distribution infrastructure components at the end of their life with more resilient materials and components, that is during normal maintenance. This could eliminate roughly 80% of the costs I just mentioned. In Canada, we recognize the urgent need for ambitious action on adaptation and mitigation, and we're committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. We've recently embarked on developing a national adaptation strategy. The changes we need to make in our energy systems to achieve our net zero commitments, from local actions to reduce diesel use in rural and remote communities, to system-wide changes, also offer opportunities to build resilience to future climate challenges. but we all need to be ready to take advantage of those opportunities. So as an example, the Government of Canada has supported efforts to ensure our electricity sector is able to analyze risk and develop adaptation plans, so it's ready to integrate these stepwise resilience measures into our planning and operations. We're also making significant investments in smart grids to modernize the delivery of electricity, prepare to onboard more renewable generation, and lever more from our existing electricity infrastructure. So just to conclude, the interconnectedness of our energy, economic, and social systems means collaboration is key to increasing the resilience of future climate systems. Governments, energy suppliers, and users, we all have a role in the success of reliable climate resilient energy systems as we accelerate our transformation to a net zero future. I really look forward to today's session, learning from everyone's experience in both the virtual and in-person panel as we look to mainstream climate resilience going forward. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Thanks, Molly. That was a fantastic setup to the day, really highlighting both the potential exposures of energy systems and also the opportunities to adapt proactively. So thank you for those remarks. Let's come back into the room and welcome Ms. Jinsum Lim. She from IEA. She is an energy and policy analyst, and she leads the organization's work on climate resilience in the energy sector. And she's going to speak briefly about IEA's climate resilience policy indicator. Jinsum, the physical floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob. Can you hear me? Okay. Great, thank you. So could you show my presentation? Thank you very much. I would like to just briefly introduce our climate resilience policy indicator. You can find this one on our website with some of the country profiles as well. Could you go to the next slide? Yes. As you can see that over 85% of countries in the IEA member and association countries are already exposed to medium or high level of climate hazard risks. So with India, China, and Mexico, they are among the highest ranked. This graph shows that aggregated level of climate hazard in 4 different areas: warming, floods, droughts, and tropical cyclones. It was assessed based on the IEA weather for energy tracker and the Inform Risk Index. Since the assessment does not cover all types of climate hazards, of course, the assessment may have limitations in capturing all different climate impacts. But we would like to use this one as a good starting point to understand which countries are more exposed to climate hazard than others. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. Although there are only 3 countries which are really highest ranked, but if we are thinking about their economy size and also their population size, it's pretty huge, which accounts for 38% of the world population and 62% of the total population of IEA and member and association countries. In addition, the total population of the countries which ranked high or medium high, which is the orange color, you can see that overall climate hazard account for 53% of the world population and 86% of the total population of IEA member and association countries. It is notable because a majority of energy supply and consumption are coming from these countries as well. As you can see, it's almost 80% of the energy supply and consumptions are coming from these countries who are more exposed to the climate hazards. Okay, could you go to the next slide, please? So climate resilience can reduce adverse impacts of climate hazards. So I just want to mention the 3 aspects we are very much keen on exploring further. So first of all, it can support clean energy transition by addressing adverse impacts of climate change on renewable energy. And also it can promote sustainable development by ensuring reliable energy. And it can boost energy security, coping with climate-driven disruptions, which is still kind of just only a few days per year, but it can be really huge in the future, or can bring enormous damage to our economy or social activities. Please go to the next slide, please. And also, we would like to focus on how climate-resilient energy systems protect vulnerable groups. So we gave some of the examples in our analysis. So we have explored 3 different dimensions. For example, you can imagine the children and the elderly are the most vulnerable to the heat-related diseases. So actually, their mortality rate is 5% higher than other age groups. And also indigenous community, as mentioned by the Canada side, so some of the indigenous communities in Canada, they are very much relying on the diesel supply, and which is sometimes very vulnerable due to the extreme weather events on their transportation or oil productions and etc. So they are currently trying hard to and implementing a lot of efforts to diversify the energy sources for the indigenous communities as well. And also, it can contribute to the gender equality, because some of the countries, you can imagine, those kind of assuring and collecting some of the energy sources are considered as some of the jobs of women, and they are spending much more time on the energy collection, which prevents their opportunity to go to the school and take education. Could you go to the next slide, please? So we would like to suggest a mainstreaming climate resilience in national plans is the first step. So we try to look at the national energy plans and also the national climate change adaptation plans, whether they are mentioning any kind of climate resilience or adaptation consideration in their national plans. And we found that half of IEA member and association countries, they are mentioning those kind of issues, addressing these issues, at least one of their national energy policies and providing some concrete actions, but we still found that half of the countries need to improve further. Could you go to the next slide as well? Thank you. And of course, it will be a little bit unfair to say that, oh, you are not really well prepared to the climate hazard. Some of the countries are less exposed to the climate hazard, and some others are more exposed to the climate hazard, which means that countries need to develop their own level of solutions. So we try to look at whether their policy preparedness level is aligned with the level of the climate hazard they are going to face. Please go to the next slide, please. So we found that we tried to divide the categories into 5 different categories: weak, inadequate, adequate, good, excellent. We found that half of the IEA countries are categorized as good or excellent compared to their climate hazard level, but we also found like 1/3 of IEA member and association countries are weak or inadequately prepared against a climate hazard. So we are doing our best to give some kind of policy recommendations to enhance climate resilience consideration in their national plans, and we hope that we can contribute to this kind of mainstreaming efforts, global efforts, and national efforts of our member and association countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jinsum. I actually want to ask you a couple of questions. Is that okay? It seems that this is a glass half full, glass half empty results. That you said that about half of the member countries have some indication of building energy resilience into their national planning, and half have not. How do you view those results?
We found also pretty encouraging results as well, because half of them are good or excellent in their preparedness level, and also even other 25% to 30% of the countries, they at least have kind of plan or mentioning of the climate resilience or adaptation of the energy sector, one of their national energy plan or climate change adaptation plan. But we found one issue is that those kind of climate resilience of the energy sector was mentioned only one side of the plan. For example, adaptation plan, they mentioned pretty briefly, but without providing any concrete actions. Or in the energy plan, they covered it, but adaptation plan, they don't really mention. So we found that some of the countries are not really aligned between the two different national plans. So I think, but we can see that over like 70% of the IE member and association countries, they already started the discussion, at least one part of their national plans. And I think that's also encouraging part, but I believe that those 50 countries and 50 countries, we can do a little bit better and we can help the improvement of their national plans.
Okay, thank you. Where can we find the results of this work, Jin-sung?
Thank you. Maybe on my last slide, there was a link. Maybe you can also Google this one, Climate Resilience Policy Indicator of the IEA. So please enter our website.
Great. And before I go to, I can see a question from the floor. Could you use your microphone, Andrew? Would you mind?
Hi. Thank you very much, Jin-sung. It's such fantastic work. It's really great to see it presented here. Just one quick question. Those interesting charts you presented, particularly at the end, for IEA and association countries together. How does it look when you sort of split out the IEA members from the association countries, which are, for those who don't know, is the emerging economies mostly? So is it... Somebody didn't like my question, I think. But is there a noticeable difference between the member countries and the association countries on average, not specifics?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew, for the question. And yes, we have a little bit. We found a notable difference because, for example, EU and ECP, they are already mentioning the adaptation part you need to consider in the national energy and climate plan. So many of the EU countries are already covering the climate resilience and adaptation aspects in their national energy and climate plans. But we also found some of the vulnerable countries or more emerging economies, they cannot really address the part. But it's a little bit hard to mention that because some of the countries, our association countries, they are very much sensitive to the climate impacts because they are one of the most vulnerable countries. So some of the countries, they address very, very well in very detail. So I think it's really depending on the countries, but I just want to mention that generally European countries address very well thanks to the NECP's consideration of the climate change adaptation aspect of energy sector. Thank you.
Great. I'm just checking online to see if there's any questions have come in, and I have another actually question myself. I think the power of these surveys is to repeat them over time. And do you have plans of actually at some frequency in time to be able to then track changes, or is this a one-off report?
We hope to do it more regularly, like 3 years, 5 years. But for now, we are currently more updating and completing our country profiles. But we hope that we have a very good regular country review report. We call it IDR, in-depth review of IEA of all of our member countries, and we have a section of the climate change and adaptation, and we would like to use that source to regularly update our climate resilience policy indicators, country profiles. But for now, we are covering only 1/3 of our member countries for now, so we would like to complete the list of the country profiles of the climate resilience policy indicator first.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm sure I, for one, would love to hear the results at COP31 or COP30 of a longitudinal study that reflects back on this work and then can help actually your members and I guess all of us to be able to track progress over time. So thank you very much, Jin-sung. Your colleague, I just heard from the chat, has just put a link to the report into the Gigabox platform. So for those of you joining online, you should be able to see that report right now. So thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move on now and ask our panelist speakers to please join us. And when they're doing that, I'm going to introduce them. We have Ms. Lara Lizano, who is serving as Costa Rica's National Energy Director, and she's on your left. And then we have in the middle we have Mr. Andrew Prague, who is serving as the Senior Advisor in the Environment Directorate of the OECD. Welcome. And finally, on the far right is Mr. Michel Berthelemy, who's a nuclear energy analyst at the Nuclear Energy Agency. And welcome to you all. I'm going to start off, Laura, with you, if I may, and ask you to talk about Costa Rica's activities in enhancing energy system resilience. Both from a general perspective and also talking about a policy angle as well. So please.
Yes. Can you hear me well? Yes. Thank you very much for the invitation and for being part of this panel. I would like to briefly introduce you to the situation in the energy sector in Costa Rica. We have an electricity mix almost renewable. We have been renewable for the last 5 or 6 years so far, renewable more than 98%. Last year we had 99.7%, and we rely mainly on hydropower. Last year we had 69% generation on hydropower, and followed by geothermal energy, 15%, and then 13% of wind power. And on the other hand, we have 99.4% of energy access. The small percentage remaining will be covered with rural electrification programs. So that's from the side of the electricity. But if we have a look at the energy mix, this is not so happy, because electricity depends, it's the source for 23%, and we still rely on fossil fuels, on 64%, which are used in transport. So that is the situation we have at the moment. So we have committed to our decarbonization plan, which was launched in 2019, and it sets the vision for 2050 with net zero. So with that, we know that the energy sector represents 76% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a high proportion of that. But the energy sector also faces the challenges of the climate change related to resilience and adaptation. So what have we done? Maybe I should point out that we are in a region in Central America and the Caribbean that is really living the impacts of climate change. We have very high frequency. The frequency of hurricanes have increased in the last years. Only last year we had 2 hurricanes in 2 months, so which hit the northern part of the region. And Costa Rica, who never before was hit by hurricanes like directly, we felt the impacts like floods and landslides and everything. It was the first time, or maybe in many times, in 2016 that we got hit, and we had a lot of losses and problems with that, and a lot of money to be invested to construction. So what have we done in our national energy policies? We tackle these problems, we set the goals, and the National Energy Plan was published in 2015 and has the vision in 2030. But it was revisited in 2019 when, after the decarbonization plan was launched, then we checked that everything was really aligned which was not really a problem because the National Energy Plan had in its main orientation was to have sustainable energy with low greenhouse gas emissions at the beginning, so it was easy to align. However, we have two main goals maybe related to resilience, and I would say the first one is to diversify our electricity mix, because like I said, we rely on hydropower. Then we should use other sources like to complement hydropower at the moment. So we have different actions for that. The first one would be to get this inventories from the natural resources done. We already have them, but you have to update that when necessary, so we can know what is the real potential for our natural resources. Then we have some, we do technological surveillance, so that we keep track of the state-of-the-art sources and tendencies and technologies. We have done this in the past. For decades, we were studying geothermal sources, and at the end, we could use it in the 90s. We introduced it. So we did the same for wind, and now we're looking at offshore wind for Costa Rica, the potential, and potential for hydrogen too. So we're looking on that, making our calculations, and of course, we have to have tools for planning, for integrating this renewable variable resources into planning. There I would like to say that our utility is national. The main utility is nationally owned, state-owned. So this utility makes the expansion plans, which try to meet supply and demand over time. So the result is that we have, for each year, how many megawatts do we have to install the capacity or to increase the capacity, and what kind of source does the system need. So in the last years, I would say from 2009, there was a decrease in demand, and it has continued. We haven't had like a recovery from 2019 from the crisis. And we also have had energy efficiency plans, and the industry has changed the structure of the industry, so it's less energy intensive. So the demand has been low, and with the pandemic last year, it went further down. So at the moment, we don't need additional capacity till 2026. And from there, we will introduce other projects that will be mainly solar, wind, and one geothermal power. Yes, 1 minute, okay. Time flies when you're having fun. So then, and with distributed generation, then we have, we think that we're walking towards diversifying the mix. And on the other side, we also think that we have the goal in the National Energy Plan to guarantee energy security. So how are we doing that? We have to address or calculate the real impacts of climate change. This has been done some in studies in the past. Actually, the International Energy Agency has done a study for the region, and we also had a previous study from the Latin American Energy Organization, OLADE, who looked at one of the biggest hydropower plants in the country, so to assess this impact. And after this, with sufficient data, we would have to address what are the main actions that we are going to do in order to be prepared to these changes from climate change. So there we would have to look at to reduce vulnerability for hydropower or for other plants or for the electricity grid, because mainly we talk about projects, but all the system is, if you have an hurricane or extreme events, then it will be affected. So we have to find out all of these measures. Finally, I would like to say that we have an adaptation plan, and we also in our NDC, which were updated last year and in December, we had this adaptation component, which indicates the need for capacity building and get some information so the decision can be made. And another important thing is to have whenever you want to do a project in the public sector, you should, we plan to put some requirements to look at the risks of the infrastructure that is going to be built. So I think I leave it like there.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to come back to you with questions. Thank you so much introducing the work in Costa Rica for La Pura Vida. And a couple of things that I took away from that is enhancing resilience through energy system diversification. Also about looking at physical potential climate change impacts on each of those individual energy sources. And then also policy mainstreaming issues and linked with capacity building. So I'm going to come back to you and ask you some questions on those lines. So if we can change pace and hear from Andrew from OECD. And Andrew, we were just chatting before about a big study that you've been working on looking at integrating economic issues with climate resilience. Would you like to share that study with us?
Sure. Thank you very much. And just to say thank you for the invitation, both to ICF and to the IEA. It's really a pleasure to be here in person. And formerly was with IEA myself, so it's great to be back with some of the team members. So yes, we are currently carrying out this big project at the OECD on better integrating climate and economic resilience. And what this is trying to do, broadly speaking, is to make sure that climate change is really at the heart of countries thinking around economic recovery and resilience after COVID-19. So one of, I suppose, the factors we've seen after the pandemic is that resilience generally has become a priority for governments. It's kind of fashionable in terms of economic resilience. So the gist of this project is to say, well, make sure that climate is really at the heart of that. What this means for the OECD, so we are an intergovernmental organization serving 38 members and also working a lot internationally now with emerging and developing countries. But we're certainly a multidisciplinary organization, essentially economic, but really with experts covering economics, tax, trade, education, labor markets, and of course environment. So what we try to do with these kind of projects is say, well, how can we leverage these expertise from right across these different domains and see what we can learn for specific issues, such as in this case the climate and economic resilience one. So that said, what does it mean for this discussion on energy sector resilience? Well, in the way we're looking at this project, we look at resilience broadly as largely the capacity to recover and adapt from shocks, and we really look at it in two separate themes. One of them is, of course, the building better systemic resilience to climate impacts, which is largely what we're talking about now. But also we're focusing on saying that the transition to net zero itself has to be resilient and durable for the long term. And there's no use just kicking off accelerating policies and investments now if they're going to be derailed by changing economic and social circumstances. So this project has resilience in the title. People think of it therefore as sort of more about resilience to climate impacts, but it's really about accelerating and maintaining the transition as well. All of that so leads me to just raise, I think, 4 kind of key points for this discussion on energy sector resilience that arise from this work. The first one is, it builds on a bit what the Canadian Vice Minister said, just really recognizing from an economic perspective just how important the energy sector is for social and economic stability. In many cases, when a climate-type disruption hits the energy system, the economic and social costs escalate very quickly and go way beyond the actual damage to the energy infrastructure. And as Jinsun clearly said, that then tends to impact vulnerable populations more and therefore has quite socially regressive impacts. And that, economically speaking, is a very important factor. In OECD, we did some modeling on Paris, the city where we're based, looking at the instance of a catastrophic sort of once-in-100-year flood. And they found that while the damage to the actual infrastructure was very heavy, up to 80% of the total cost was actually due to the disruptions in energy and transportation. So just highlighting how important that is. that's the first point then about the importance of importance of the energy sector for economic and social stability. Secondly, really saying that resilience mindset really has to find a way to get a better trade-off between just efficiency and resilience. This is a general theme among the whole resilience discussion across all different sectors, not just energy and not just climate. But in this case, finding that sort of trade-off between the risk minimization and cost efficiency, going from the kind of least cost to least regrets approach is really important. There's a well-known example of what happened in the Texas electricity system over the last year, where it was simplifying, but it was almost brought to its knees twice, once by extreme heat and once by extreme cold. And there are several reasons you can point to about how that system was set up for kind of cost efficiency, not interconnected with energy-only markets, without a sort of capacity market that would build in redundancy, and the impacts. You could say that the market did what it was supposed to do, and the prices shot sky high to cover the shortfalls, but that caused immense economic and social suffering, and it's a clear case of where building some resilience and redundancy into the system is important. So that's the second point around this resilience cost trade-off. The third point I want to make is, in this project as a whole, we're really trying to encourage a sort of systems thinking approach, which is something that's easy to say and a lot harder to do. But in the terms of energy sector resilience, I think it is an interesting one. It's very important to develop, to plan, prioritize, build energy infrastructure that is designed for future and projected climate impacts. But it's not enough just to make each project itself resilient to those climate impacts. It's important to think about what can be done to most effectively make the system as a whole resilient to how the climate might be changing and what those impacts might be. There's one small example in France where there was a case where there was significant damage to distribution lines from storm damage, and one of the plans was to bury all of those lines, which was hugely expensive, but it was worked out that actually when you look at the system service delivery, that actually having a rapid response system of mobile generators that could be put on site and power the isolated parts of grids at times when the distribution lines were down was actually a more effective response at the system level rather than burying every single distribution line. So it's just a case of thinking of the system level. And then the other element of thinking around systems is it's not just about the infrastructure, it's about what happens to supply and demand of energy when faced with these climate impacts. And a little bit linked to the Texas example I raised, but and it's often the case when climate shocks hit, energy demand actually goes up. If cooling in a heat wave or heating in a cold snap, even over time with slow onset events, migration can shift demand patterns, and planning for just this, not just the infrastructure itself, but how to incorporate this change in supply and demand is very important. And then lastly, of these kind of four key points from the broader thinking on resilience is back to what I said about making the transition itself resilient. And in the energy system case, it's obviously a very noticeable factor. Costa Rica is a particular example where you're already almost 100% renewable electricity system, but in most cases we're moving rapidly towards a variable renewable-based system, which of course is largely weather dependent with solar, wind, hydro. They all have close connections to the climatic conditions. And at the same time as even in the best scenarios of emissions reduction globally, we're still going to have significant climate impacts. So just thinking about how to make sure that those renewable systems are built to be resilient in a broader context of electricity security, not just about climate impacts. So bringing climate into the thinking around making sure that renewable-based systems are fully flexible, fully interconnected, with making the most of demand management and so on is, for our point of view, an important part of the resilience question. So I'll leave it there. Happy to go into more of the kind of specific policies later, but that was just my initial 4 points.
Thank you, Andrew. And before we move on, where can we find the outcomes of this work, Andrew?
This particular project is still ongoing, actually. Some of the learnings I was talking about come from a broader package of work that we've been doing at the OECD for some time on adaptation and resilience. So it's probably best to Google OECD energy sector climate resilience. You'll find studies that link to what I'm saying. But the bigger project in climate and economic resilience is still a work in progress, shall we say. So watch this space.
Fantastic. Couple of takeaways for me, that resilience is at the heart of the energy transition. I would add the beating heart of the energy transition, actually, and also really emphasizing the critical economic importance of stable, resilient power systems for both broader economies, for economic development, and of course for issues of energy access and sustainable development. So thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. I'm going to move over to you, Michelle. Michelle is from NEA, and Michelle, we were talking earlier, you've been doing a lot of work around climate resilience, and you have a new report out. Is that right?
Exactly, and thank you, Robert, for the invitation, and thank you for our colleagues from IE as well. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. We are the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. We are a semi-autonomous agency, like the IEA, part of the broad OECD family. We focus on nuclear energy issues, ranging from nuclear safety to nuclear waste management, including technology development and economics. And as part of this last stream of work, we are just about to publish today, hopefully, a new report that looks at the vulnerability of nuclear power plants to climate change and approaches to adaptations. It has been said by the previous speakers, resilience is at the heart of the energy transition. And I'd like to frame my remark more specifically to the electricity sector. We've seen during COVID that the electricity sector was very indispensable to our economies. And we see also from all low carbon transitions pathway, including the one from IEA, that the electricity sector will play a growing role moving forward for the overall economy. So this makes it even more critical to consider today the resilience of the electricity sector to adaptation. When it comes to nuclear power plants, we can see such impact of climate change potentially at several levels, be it in terms of higher air or water temperature that will impact nuclear power plants cooling, be it in terms of seawater rise that could impact nuclear power plants, such as nuclear power plants on the coast. And last but not least, greater variability and more extreme weather events, which are also important, such as storm, droughts, floods, and these can disrupt nuclear power plants as well. A key finding from the report we are publishing today, I hope, is that nuclear power plants, the nuclear sector as a whole, has been taken into account for a very long time weather climate conditions. And that means that at the level of licensing, design, siting of nuclear power plants, climate conditions, including extreme climate conditions, are often taken into account. And what it means, as we are today already living some of the first signs of climate change, we see, looking at the last 10 years, we look at data about nuclear power plants, we see that these extreme weather events, a lot of them being related to climate change, have been increasing. But what we also see from the data is that the impact on nuclear power plants has been decreasing, to the sense that we look at loss of nuclear power plant availability over the last decades due to these climate conditions, extreme climate conditions. We see that it has been declining. And for us, this is a sign that the nuclear sector, nuclear power plants, are already adapting to climate change. Which to some extent is not a surprise, because as I say, extreme weather conditions are often taken into account at the design, licensing and siting stage. A second finding of the study moving forward, when we think about the impact of climate change for the next 3 decades or more, is that we identify a number of levers for nuclear power plants to further adapt to climate change. There's a range of them. If we think about existing nuclear plants, we see that often you can have a small retrofit engineering change, such as improving cooling system, heat exchangers, that can allow nuclear power plants to better withstand the impact of climate change. We could also consider more significant retrofits of nuclear power plants. Of course, this has a price tag, and I will come back to that. But this means that more significant retrofit is also possible for nuclear power plants to adapt to climate change. And then if we think about new nuclear power plants, then the options are even more wide open to the extent that thinking about siting on nuclear power plants, constructions, water intake, all of these technical elements, factors, all of them can be taken into account to really think today about what will be the climate over the next 3-4 decades. And this is something that, in fact, when we license a new nuclear power plants, you already do. Now, the question, of course, and it has been touched upon by Andrew and others, is how can we do that cost effectively? This is important. A lot of the small measures are often very cost effective, but another and the third finding of the study is that long-term planning is critical to make sure that we can do that cost effectively. We see a number of examples. For instance, Finland is one of them where we will, for some nuclear power plant, we may want to consider a deeper water intake due to some of the impacts that can be attributed to climate change. And we see that doing that today is expensive, but if it would have been done at the design stage, then this would have a very, very minimal impact on the nuclear power plants. We also see that taking this into consideration for operational practices is also a very good way to do it cost effectively. In particular, if you're thinking about utilities that operate a range of power plants, nuclear, but also other technology, low carbon technology, in particular, being able to optimize hydro resources with nuclear power plants, and so optimizing the use of the reservoir so that it's available for nuclear is also a way to make sure we can tackle the impact of climate change on nuclear power plants. And we have good examples, such as in Spain, where the utilities have been managing that very well. And my fourth and last point to conclude is we do identify a number of ways for nuclear power plants to adapt to climate change. But as we think about it, it's very clear to us that this is a system issue, and Andrew has very rightly pointing towards that. And we very much encourage policymakers not only to think about the resilience of a given technology, but to think in terms of what is the overall resilience of my energy mix, my electricity system, and doing so, thinking about what are the complementarities between different low carbon technologies, so that I can improve the overall resilience of my energy system. And I think this is also something we heard from Costa Rica. So it's good to see policymakers putting that into practice already. And with that, thank you, and looking forward to discussions.
Well, look, and thank you, Michel, and thank you for explaining the work that you're doing, and we're looking forward to seeing it, I'm sure, as you are, online, the study.
I've seen it, but not online yet.
Look, what I'm going to do, actually, we have like 5 minutes before we need to move to the next session, and Lara, what I was going to do, given that you have the floor and you have an audience of international organizations in front of you, what are the key things that you think that that will help you at a national level, and again, your colleagues in other national governments who are really doing the work of enhancing energy resilience while decarbonizing? What are the things that you're looking for over the next 5 years?
Yes, I would say that it's important for us to have support from different organizations, not only at a country level, but at regional level, because we think that, like I said, information is key. So the first thing that we have to do is to have all the information and data that we can have made available. For example, we signed memorandum of cooperation and MOU with at the regional level with the International Energy Agency to support us as a region in these topics of resilience, like to assess what are the real impacts for each of the countries. So that is very important. And I would also say to exchange information on the solutions. What are the solutions for the different problems? It will not be the same if we're talking about droughts or talking about impacts of hurricanes, or so it will be specific. But I think every country has its own situation, but many countries have many things in common. So I think these exchanges and these studies that you made, it will be very good for us to look at those, the data and the solutions that are there. So I think that's we have to start by that. Well, we have started already, but yeah, I think that's an important thing for us, like to support the decision making and if we have to, because the policies have to be checked all the time, updated, and with more data, then we have more different policies or different actions, maybe. So I think that's it. That is a key point.
Yeah, thank you. That you touched on both national level information and support, and also at a regional level. I assume because of regional climate similarities and potentially other similarities as well. So thank you so much. Andrew and Michelle, how are you going to support Lara and her colleagues at a national level?
Well, firstly, I should say we're very happy to work with Costa Rica as a recent member of the OECD. Very proud to have you on board of our membership. I think that you mentioned the sort of data and information as being so important, and certainly for the international community, that is something that we can do better at making available, sharing, and working on capacity building in general. All of this work around trying to understand planning, prioritizing, building new infrastructure based on not historical climate data, but on projections of what's likely to happen is easy to say, and again, very hard to do. The climate modeling is getting better and better internationally and also regionally in country level. So there's a lot that we can do to make that more available, make countries, policymakers, but also the general public just more aware of how good projections are becoming for what we should be planning against, and to make sure that infrastructure is built in a way that is resilient to what's likely coming rather than what we've seen in the last 30 years, which is likely to be different. So that's one area. Another, I think, is around comparability of actually understanding in what ways countries are vulnerable to these different climate risks. We're trying to work on developing vulnerability indicators across the economy, so not just for energy. It's a sort of the hardest part of climate indicators, if you like. Everyone can work on CO2 emissions and energy technology levels and things and have those as indicators, but really understanding what it means to be vulnerable to different risks is something that I think would be useful as well to help countries compare each other. And then the last one I'd say is pure and simple on the actual policy best practice sharing. And both yourself from Costa Rica and the Vice Minister from Canada talked about the work you've been doing on national, regional, local planning. Organizations like us can really help to pull those together and show what's been done in different countries and where there are good ideas, where there are less good ideas, and that's another area where we can really help, I think.
Thank you. Michelle?
Couple of things for me. In terms of what we do and we can do for helping policymakers, in particular in our member countries. First is, I think there is often a misnomer, and I haven't touched upon that moving forward 2050 in a world where we will have to live with climate change. Nuclear power plants, in particular nuclear power plants on the coast, will be underwater, and so are totally unfit to adapt to climate change. And really providing authoritative studies, fact-based policy evidence on this matter, I think is important to help our policymakers to think about the options to build future low carbon energy systems. The second one is, and I think from what I talked about earlier, there are also a lot of lessons learned from nuclear power plants that have, for a very long time taken into account climate conditions, including extreme climate conditions. Maybe just to give a couple more examples, we have nuclear power plants that are basically situated in a desert, in the UAE, in Arizona. So this is something that we know nuclear power plants can already do today, and I think sharing this best practice also with the rest of the electricity system, in particular working with the IEA on that, is also something which I think would be useful for policymakers.
Yeah, thank you. Look, we do have to wrap this up. So I, for one, am encouraged by what I've learned from the three of you this morning in terms of the progress in both developing the studies and analysis to enhance the transition, but also the policy settings and the practical action that we heard from you, Lara, from Costa Rica, both through energy resilience enhancement through diversification, physical impact assessment work being integrated into investments and so on. I think really a number of those messages came through, and I would just say please share these studies when they come out. We can share them with our colleagues joining virtually, and again this is going to be recorded, and so people can come back to those later, so please do that. So please join our colleagues and with a round of applause for joining us. Thank you. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take a quick stretch, and then we're going to move into our virtual session. We have three fantastic speakers lined up for you virtually. What we're going to do here is that we're going to ask each of them to present for 5 minutes, and then we're going to then go to a Q&A process after that. First up, in fact, I'll introduce all three speakers, and then I'll introduce each one as they come up. First, we have Mr. Alexander Lane, who's joining virtually from Washington, D.C. He serves as the Energy Division Lead in the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, followed by Ms. Neha Mukli, who is a Senior Energy and Climate Change Specialist in the World Bank. And then finally, we'll hear from Ms. Roberta Boscolo, who is the Lead Weather and Climate Service for Energy at the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. So, Alex, I hope you're there ready to join us virtually.
I am indeed, Rob, and thank you for the introduction. If you could put my PowerPoint up, that'd be wonderful. But yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today from both you and the ICF team and the IEA. I'll share just a couple of examples today of USAID's work supporting power sector resilience. We can go on to the next slide. So USAID is a grant-making organization. We don't provide loans. Although we do work very closely with the U.S. Development Finance Corporation that does provide substantial loans in the energy space. But as a result of our grant-making focus, we tend to focus more on human and institutional capital, as well as soft infrastructure. So that leads us to work quite a bit in energy sector governance, procurement, and engaging the private sector and leveraging private sector investment into the energy sector, as well as management best practices. Moving on to an example of what we do in the resilience space, you'll see that planning is going to be a bit of a theme of the examples I speak about. My colleagues from the Nuclear Energy Administration and the, Nuclear Energy Agency, the OECD, also talked about the importance of planning. I'll talk about it a bit as well. So moving on to some of our work in the Lao People's Democratic Republic, very hydro-dependent country, and following heavy rainfalls in that country in 2018, there were significant impacts on the power system. So the government and USAID worked together to develop a power sector assessment that would ultimately strive to improve the resilience of the power sector to such events. This was an assessment that very importantly was very collaborative. And the process focused on identifying threats to the power system. These are things such as extreme precipitation, flooding, landslides, and looked at their likelihood and the extent of the impact of each of these events. And then through that process, identified the vulnerabilities that these threats exacerbated. Things such as compliance with codes, dam construction, and power system regulations. I mentioned that broad stakeholder engagement and the collaborative process was crucial. It involved collaboration across government, the utility, and civil society, with organizations such as the Department of Natural Resources, identifying hazards, and the Women's Union, making sure that the assessment identified gender equity goals in its considerations. The result of this assessment was a prioritized list of risks that were based on the effect of power delivery, capital and operating expenses, as well as the health and safety impacts. These were the considerations that both Andrew and Molly mentioned as the sort of the downstream effects of power outages as a result of extreme events. And this prioritization identified as top priorities, actually incorporating extreme event planning, better data as a need, and diversification of the energy supply, ultimately leading to the development of the first solar plant in Laos. We move on to the next slide. I will talk a little bit about integrated resource and resilience planning. I think almost everyone is familiar with IRPs, the integrated resource planning, and adding the R for resilience is becoming more and more common. This moves us from a least cost to a least regrets model, which is explicitly considering different policy options in the planning process and trying to minimize regrets. And one way to look at this is when you add a least regrets element to the planning process, of course, it's going to increase costs a little bit because you're no longer minimizing cost in the power system. What you're doing is you're adding a little bit of an insurance policy to make sure that you can bounce back. And ultimately, it's going to lower the costs overall, both in system repairs and in economic impacts. So we engaged in this in Ghana. The government decided it wanted to include the resilience component after a 2012 gas pipeline rupture, something that I'm familiar with being from California, which we recently had one off our coast as well. But anyways, that gas pipeline rupture caused extreme power outages in the country. So along with the government, we went through basically a three-stage process that you can see on the slide here, starting with development of our data sets and identifying assumptions. So looking at data such as the generation supply and imports of electricity from other countries, transmission and electricity demand, as well as validating assumptions such as the fuel use projections, estimates for costs, as well as the laws and regulations that would be in place. This was all then plugged into a modeling, or I should say developing a model for analysis, taking a reference case and developing that reference case against scenarios. The scenarios are based on different strategies. So strategies such as improving the amount of indigenous resources, diversifying resources, or even increasing the amount of electricity exports to neighboring countries. And this factored in things such as a sensitivity analysis, as well as assessments of risk and resilience. Ultimately, what this process leads to is a least regrets portfolio strategy. And then that strategy, as a result of this work, was integrated into this power sector master plan. And what that master plan emphasized was the need to develop domestic resources, become less dependent on imports. It actually recommended halting construction of thermal power plants in the near and medium term, and then emphasize the need for a greater integration of solar photovoltaics and wind power into the energy system. And then I'll move on, and my final example, we'll talk about digital and cyber. If we can advance the slide, please. Of course, we're all very, very well aware that digitization is having huge impacts on the power sector and enabling us to become more resilient and manage the sector in better ways. But this also creates a vulnerability in itself. USAID and the Department of Energy National Renewable Energy Lab are working particularly in this, well, we're working everywhere, but particularly in the Caribbean with the Caribbean Electric Utility Services Corporation, which recently hosted a webinar series looking at the vulnerabilities associated with cyber threats. We presented in that series 11 building blocks for a well-rounded cybersecurity framework that included things such as governance, cybersecurity awareness, incident response, and operational technology controls. This is something that we continue doing today, and we are actually postured now so that we're available to bring in the National Renewable Energy Lab to provide 2-day vulnerability assessments that can help utilities and other organizations in the power sector to identify their vulnerabilities and establish a baseline for their cybersecurity systems and assess their progress in making improvements and reducing vulnerabilities in the future that will allow them to bounce back better if need be. And for anyone interested in learning more, particularly about this work and getting in touch with us, I've added the website for resilientenergy.org for the Resilient Energy platform for anyone who would like to visit that. And with that, I will end my presentation and turn it over back to Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thank you so much. And look, before we move to Neha, I'm excited because the USAID climate strategy was released yesterday, Alex, and I know that you prepare these slides before the strategy was released. Do you have any immediate comment, feedback that you'd like to share with us all?
Sure. Of course, we're very excited about the new strategy, and I'm glad you asked about it because I was gonna have to try to find a way to work it into any other questions that somebody asked me, if anybody provided any questions. I think the most important thing to recognize is that the climate strategy is right now is out for open comment. So anybody who's interested in providing feedback on the strategy is welcome to do it. I just tested it out, and if you Google USAID climate strategy right now, it is the first thing that will pop up when you Google it. This strategy is exciting to us in a couple of ways. One is that it really mobilizes all of USAID to address climate change. USAID is an organization that does humanitarian assistance, global health, governance, democracy programs, agricultural programs, as well as saving our forests and working in the power sector and reducing emissions. We're mobilizing all of our resources to work on climate. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is we recognize that we need to both be thinking about lowering emissions now, and the way we structured our strategy is immediate action, leveraging the entire agency to have impact now, but we also think that we need to be focusing more on the long term and mobilizing the agency to think about how we can engage our partner countries to develop systems for the future, where by 2050 and 2070, whatever year out in the future, the developing world in which we engage is really prepared to have a zero carbon or very low carbon energy system, agriculture system, urban settlements, whatever it may be.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for sharing. And for those of you that want to understand more about the strategy, the US Pavilion is, of course, only 2 blocks over, and I'm sure there'll be a series of events over the next few days. I'm keen to move on to Neha if you're ready to roll. Neha is going to speak to us about integrating climate and development from a World Bank perspective. Neha, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks to you, ICF and IEA, for organizing this and having me here on joining the panel. As you mentioned today, into my presentation, I'll be talking about how climate action is central to growth and development. If I could also request my slides to be put up on the screen, please. Thank you. Great. So we've heard a great deal about how, energy sector gets impacted with climate change and its impacts. And with the previous panelists, we also heard about what are the wider impacts on on the economies and fiscal and financial systems. And this is where really, a major concern from the World Bank's perspective comes through, whereby the World Bank has put climate at the center of its work. The World Bank sees how climate change actually impacts or hinders progress towards our mission of ending extreme poverty and addressing inequality issues around the world. And that's how we've been working towards integrating mainstreaming climate action across all our engagements. In terms of specifically on the economic systems, it's important to note, not just the energy infrastructure impact, but also the wider economy impacts, the fiscal burden the countries face that already have tight fiscal spaces that get exacerbated by these power sector and energy infrastructure impacts. And not to mention the debt sustainability issues that arise from having to rebuild, and often in times they have to borrow to rebuild damaged infrastructure, especially in context of extreme weather events. So with that in mind, I will go through these slides to give a quick overview of what climate action means in the context of World Bank's engagement with its countries, member countries, and also specifically focusing on energy sector planning and policies, what that translates to. So moving on to the next slide. Here we have just a quick overview of the World Bank's recent climate change action plan, with about 35% of our financing targeted to be dedicated towards climate finance, climate action. This is a 25% increase from the previous commitment period. And the key element of this is 50% of this climate finance is to be balanced between both mitigation and adaptation engagements. So there's equal importance being put for both mitigation and adaptation action, which really speaks to the heart of the point being made earlier as well, that decarbonization and resilience development are not separate agendas or separate objectives to pursue, but really need to be integrated across the energy transition and broader economy-wide transition. Moving on to the next slide here. Now, just a quick snapshot. We all know we're discussing how climate and natural disasters impact the energy sector through extreme temperature, rainfall, sea level rise. Of course, a lot of this brought by hurricanes and extreme weather events, flooding risks especially. Now, the key part to always remember, and which is often forgotten, at least for a lot of us energy sector professionals, is it impacts not just the supply side of power, but also the demand side of it, which is also a growing side of impact that needs to be assessed and addressed. The considerations in terms of resilience and building, climate impacts and resilience building have to be both at the energy systems level and individual infrastructure project level as well. This comes across in considerations for technology choices, siting, design standards for infrastructure, which have to be underpinned by sound policy decisions and analytics to support those decisions. Going to the next slide. Now, we know that climate change poses serious risks for energy supply, for reliable power supply. However, there is still a challenge in terms of integrating and mainstreaming this across our energy system planning and engagement. And after a careful sort of discussions and stakeholder consultations with countries, with energy agencies, utilities across our countries, one thing that became clear was while there's recognition of impacts, there's lack of consolidated frameworks for how to integrate these impacts and corresponding resilience actions into energy planning and infrastructure design. A lot of that owes to methodology gaps and data gaps. Of course, the need for funding to implement this in an enhanced way, and of course, and looking at it from a more holistic view of economic resilience. So through this, we were also able to identify actions and opportunities that, if the data and methodology are made available and together worked with the relevant agencies, it requires very little additional work. Of course, funding needs to be available. So we're working on that front for our countries, and developing technical resources that are to be made available both for internal and external use within the bank and with our countries. Moving on to the next slide. This is a quick snapshot of what the World Bank's global engagement on energy resilience looks like. We have organized this across 3 broad streams, developing data and methodologies and tools for upstream engagement to help understand climate impacts on energy systems and how to integrate resilience. Then guidance notes, best practice resources on what is being done in different geographical contexts, in different types of energy systems, and what are the possible resilience measures for different types of impacts, and then supporting those with pilots and case studies through our own engagements, and also building on the experience through work done by other agencies that we've heard about so far. And this all is to support both upstream technical assistance and capacity building with countries, and supporting infrastructure financing and policy financing through our own country engagements and financing. Moving on to the next slide. These are just a few examples of our country engagements to give you a snapshot, an idea of how resilience building spans across the power system value chain, from energy generation to transmission and distribution, and not to mention the demand side, whether it's space cooling, and more recently with an increasing need for stronger resilient cold chains for vaccines, for agriculture produce, etc. And next slide, please. This is my last slide, just provides a quick snapshot of how we're working with countries, with technical partners, with experts in the space on building the technical resources, filling and bridging the data gap and methodology gap, and making it available to energy agencies, to utilities in the countries in form of technical resources, in form of learning opportunities, and most importantly, resources, funding and financial resources to implement this. And with that, I will wrap it up and back over to you, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha. And I would encourage all of you, if you haven't already done so, to visit the World Bank website to access the range of tools, guidance methodologies, and information sources that Neha mentioned in her presentation. There really is a fantastic set of resources. Neha, I'm going to come back to you with a question in a minute, but I do want to yield the floor to Roberto Boscolo from WMO. Roberto, the virtual floor is yours. Roberto, I think you're on mute.
Really sorry. Yes, if you can, thank you very much. And if you can already put my slides up. So I'll go straight, I think, to the second slide. And I'm going to, of course, not say anything more about resilience on energy infrastructure not adding more of what has been said so far in this wonderful panel and side event. But I just want to give you more a perspective of what we do at WMO and how we support resilience and adaptation measure to energy and to other sector. So first of all, I want to just start saying that WMO publishes every year the state of the global climate. This is based on indicators of the greenhouse gases, temperature, glaciers, sea ice, and ocean heat and acidification. So these are all elements that can be used to understand how is the trends, including sea level, for example. This year, WMO published the state of the global climate. Early this week, WMO launched the State of the Global Climate of 2021, which is just preliminary of the first 9 months of this year. And the key messages that need to be taken into consideration, especially for climate resilience infrastructure, are here in this slide, just going quickly through that. So we have the major greenhouse gases continue to increase despite the COVID and despite the little reduction in greenhouse gases emission, and especially fossil fuel due to the COVID pandemic. We have global mean temperature, which reached 1.08 above the pre-industrial average. And although the 2021 is going to be a little bit cooler than the previous years because of La Niña, it's going to be again within the 10th as hottest years on record. The rate of global sea level has increased and has reached actually new heights in 2021. And the rate of growth is accelerating. This is very important. We have, as I said, the global cryosphere is consistent with the recent multi-decadal trends. We had exceptional heat wave affecting North America, extreme heat in the Mediterranean this summer, and also a significant hurricane in North Atlantic season was Ida, which made a landfall in Louisiana on August with sustained 1-minute winds of 240 kilometers per hour, which had a major damage and storm surge inundation. And also we can mention also the rainfall, the extreme rainfall in China this summer as well, and in Western Europe. So next slide, please. And I want to also highlight that because climate impacts are different in different regions, it is important to have a regional approach when we think about climate resilience. And we have also, WMO is started to launch now regional information in the reports for a different region. We started with Africa, and then we added Latin America, and then we add also South Asia. Next one. As proposed the IPCC in the assessment report, the risk framework, when we talk about climate risks, is really an interaction of the climate hazards, which is the physical trigger of the climate system, the exposure, which means the people, the ecosystem, and the assets at stake, and the vulnerability, which is the susceptibility to harm. And climate change responses, therefore, involve making decisions under uncertainty in a changing world with judgment informed by science and broad values and goals. So understanding climate risk really require an integrated approach, which consists of the physical system and also other non-physical parameter. Next one, please. So the way that WMO is addressing this integrated approach is through what we call it climate services. And the climate services is the provision of climate information for decision making. And information that WMO can provide to build the climate services are at different timescales. First of all, the information based on the, first of all, we need to provide information based on the current and past climate to serve as a baseline for decision maker to assess how the climate condition affect their domain. And without understanding this baseline, it is difficult to consider to understand how harmful future climate events may be. And then we have decision maker has to understand their exposure. After they understand their exposure with the current and past climatic condition, they need to have information on the future climate condition to assess their future exposure and the risk that may arise. So there are three broad timescales of interest, which are basically based on the modeling system and the scientific research, and also the availability of climate data that underpin these services. And the first of this timescale is the short timescale climate variability, which is services information based on forecast for the coming months and year. So based on the seasonal forecast.
Roberta?
The second broad timescales of interest is longer timescales, climate change based on multi-decadal climate projection. And then the third one is really the timescale of interest of the multi-annual decadal timescales. It's the combination of the natural climate variability superimposed on the longer term climate change. And these are information that are available and WMO produce and put available for the community to be used. Next one, please.
Roberta, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, Roberta, I have to give you a 1 minute warning, I'm afraid. We're running very short on time.
Okay, so just to say that WMO has published a methodology to help to use the identified past, present, and future climate condition. And also we have a tool which has been developed with WMO, the Green Climate Fund, and the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute, which is available, is a climate information platform for users to access the site-specific climate data and information. And then I just quickly say that there are several examples. Next one, please. That I was going to explain how to use this methodology. We used the methodology to develop climate action for the energy sector in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And also there is another example, next one, maybe I spend just a few seconds more, which is the example of the data set provided by the Climate and Energy Indicator for Europe as a part of the Copernicus Climate Change Services. And it is the Energy Operational Services. And these are indicators like for the energy sector, like air temperature, precipitation, incoming solar radiation, wind speed at 10 and 100 meters, and mean sea level air pressure. So for the energy indicator, combined with the energy model to derive energy indicator like electricity demand, wind, solar, and power, and hydropower. And also it is considering the projection data set from 2005 to the end of this century. And I hope you can go and play with it and use it for your decision making. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberta. And I should just say to all of you here in the room and online is that these presentations will be available through the platform for you to be able to download and access the fantastic resources that are linked to in the presentations. The organizers here in the room have been very gracious of giving us another 5 minutes to do a very short Q&A before we finish. And Neha, perhaps if I could go back to you, I know that you've done a lot of work in the Caribbean to really focus on these issues of enhancing energy system resilience really on the ground. So what are the key lessons that you'd just like to share out with us for a minute or so?
Certainly. Thanks, Rob, for that question. I think Caribbean and in general, the small islands are...
Sorry, go ahead.
Caribbean and small islands in general are very unique in the context that they are highly exposed to not just physical risks of climate change, but also the transition risks given the heavy reliance on imported fossil fuels, and of course the fiscal impacts that come with it. So our engagement in the Caribbean is looking at both a low carbon and resilient energy transition holistically, looking at strong upstream technical analysis that takes a look starting at engineering assessments for power system vulnerability, looking at developing capacity of the utilities for emergency preparedness and planning and response, and then working together hand in hand with utilities and regulators along with the ministries on integrated resource and resilience planning. And taking all of this work is to develop a pipeline of resilient low carbon energy investments that can then be financed through a regional facility that we are working on, a regional financing facility for the Eastern Caribbean that we are now working on with the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. So taking a whole system value chain from upstream analysis, capacity building, project pipeline development to innovative financing.
Thank you, Neha. Alex, I'm just going to come back to you and perhaps just ask for a closing reflection from you from what you've heard from the session so far and how you think the new USAID climate change strategy can support the work to enhance energy resilience.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind listening to the other presentations. I think one of them I already mentioned, which is the real importance of planning and the role that development agencies such as USAID, the World Bank, and others can play in helping our partners countries plan for a somewhat uncertain future, both in terms of the extreme events that they're going to face, as well as the rapidly changing technology landscape when it comes to electricity generation, transmission, and distribution, as well as all the other services that can enhance the effectiveness of the grid and increase the resilience. And the other thing I think as well that needs to be mentioned is the role of private sector investments in the power sector. As we look at the climate change impacts on with a wide lens in all the areas that need investment, the power sector is one of the ones that's probably easier to monetize. Many of the, well, certainly electricity generation, but a lot of the services can be monetized. So a lot of our focus should be on bringing in private sector investment to the energy space and allowing public finance to be freed up for other critical infrastructure that is not as easy to monetize.
Thank you, Alex. I'm getting some wind-up signals here, I'm afraid, Roberta, so I'm afraid we've run out of time to come back and ask you and your other panelists any further questions. So with that, I think I'll just make some closing reflections on this panel. The couple of key takeaways for me, coming back to this issue of enhancing energy system resilience is like the sort of beating heart of enhancing national economic resilience in the face of climate change, both in terms of the energy system itself and also the flow-on impacts in terms of broader economic and social development. I think that came through extremely clearly. The other thing I think that came through for me is really the very rapid transition in terms of integration into national planning that we heard. Progress is being made, and we heard very clearly that there is progress to be made in the future, but yet I think that there are very clearly lessons that can be drawn on for us all to really empower this transition. So with that, I just want to thank all the panelists virtually and those in person for joining us. And finally, to thank IEA, who have just been such a fantastic partner in organizing this session. So I wish you all a good day here in COP and all for the rest of your day online. Thank you.